This presentation is on Geoffrey Chaucer. This is a scene from a very famous tapestry called the Bayeux Tapestry, and it shows a scene. The tapestry is 200 feet long, and this shows a scene. The whole tapestry tells the story of the Norman Conquest. We're going to talk about the Norman Conquest in a minute, and the scene here on the screen is just one of the scenes that is portrayed in the tapestry. That's going to be the background for our timeline here. We're going to finish up with the medieval period. Anglo-Saxon culture, as we talked about last time, flourished in Great Britain for hundreds of years, and it reached its pinnacle under King Alfred in the 9th century. But in the early 11th century, there was a new Germanic tribe called the Normans or the Norsemen, and they had occupied the area today that is northern France, and from there they moved into England, and this was a major event known as the Norman Conquest. And over the next several hundred years, the Norman influence fundamentally transformed English literary culture. So while the language spoken by the new Norman rulers in England was French, that language melded with the common Anglo-Saxon vernacular, and vernacular means like the lay language or the language spoken by the native people, sort of everyday language. And that melding of French and Anglo-Saxon gradually evolved into what today is called Middle English. And reading the Canterbury Tales, you are reading Middle English. So this event, the Norman Conquest, occurs in 1066. The last Anglo-Saxon king, Harold II, is defeated by William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings. This is on the south coast of England. And that battle, resulting in Harold II's defeat, he was actually killed in the battle, marked the beginning of the Norman Conquest that went on for the next 50, 60, 100 years or so, period of civil wars. Finally stabilized after several hundred years, 200, almost 300 years of Norman influence in England. Geoffrey Chaucer is born around 1343, and by this time, Middle English has been around for a while, and it begins to be used in official state and legal documents. So Middle English begins to displace French as the official language. And Chaucer just happened to be born at the right time. By the early 1360s, he was late adolescent, early adulthood, and this is the time when Middle English is becoming not just the sort of the official language of the state, but also the language of literary culture. And Chaucer happens to be there and is writing his poetry, his works in Middle English. And the medieval period ends towards the end of the 15th century. One event that signaled that change, that transformation, was the introduction of the printing press by William Caxton. I mentioned this last time. I'm mentioning it here again. William Caxton actually supervised the printing of a couple of editions of the Canterbury Tales. 1476 is when the printing press arrived in England. So let's talk a little bit more about Geoffrey Chaucer's life, what we know about him. And we know quite a lot, fortunately. That picture of Chaucer that you see on the screen, that is from an illuminated manuscript or illustrated manuscript of the Canterbury Tales called the Ellesmere manuscript. We're going to talk a little bit more about it in a few minutes. That is a portrayal of Chaucer. So as I said before, he was born right around 1343. We don't know the exact year of his birth. But he was born to a successful London wine merchant. And wine was obviously an important commodity, and it would have been a commodity consumed by the nobility. So Chaucer's father probably had many royal connections with the royal family. And by the 1350s, as a teenager, probably through his father's negotiations with his clients, he gets Chaucer appointed as a page in the residence of Prince Lionel, who was second son of the king at the time, King Edward III, and he served as a page in his household. But by the 1360s, Chaucer is now actually a member of the king's household, where he meets his wife. Chaucer meets his wife Philippa, who's a servant to the queen at the time, and he completes his first major literary work during this period called the Book of the Duchess, which was written to commemorate the death of the wife of Prince Lionel's younger brother, John of Gaunt. She died in 1368. So that's around the time that he wrote the Book of the Duchess, which is his first major literary work. In the 1370s, in service to the king, he goes on several diplomatic missions to the continent of Europe, twice to Italy. These are important trips for Chaucer in terms of his literary development because he's exposed in Italy to important Italian vernacular writers like Dante Alighieri, with whom you may be familiar if you've read Dante's Inferno, the poet Petrarch, who would be hugely influential on 16th century Renaissance poets. We'll come back to Petrarch a little later this semester. And Boccaccio. And Boccaccio's probably the most important in this group for our purposes because he wrote a collection of stories with a frame of travel companions who are trying to avoid the Black Death in Italy, and so they travel from villa to villa and they entertain themselves by telling stories. And in a lot of ways, it echoes what Chaucer is doing in the Canterbury Tales, and in fact, some of the stories themselves have intriguing parallels. We don't have any clear evidence that Chaucer read the Decameron of Boccaccio, but it seems likely that he knew of it. So from 1374 to 85, Chaucer was appointed Controller of Customs for the Port of London. This is important because it puts Chaucer in interaction with lots of people. He is overseeing, one of the things that he's overseeing is the taxation of exports of wool. This was the major commodity that England produced that was being sent to continental Europe. And the taxes on wool is what funded a lot of the king's projects and wars. So this was a very important post for Chaucer to have. And like I said, it put him in contact with lots of people on the street, merchants, sailors, shippers, just a great post for interacting with people. Around this time, during this period, while he's Controller of Customs, he writes his first collection of verse tales called The Legend of Good Women. And I just mention it here because it allows him to experiment with linked stories, which is something he would do again writing the Canterbury Tales. From 1385 to 86, he is appointed Justice of the Peace for the County of Kent, and he actually lives for a time within sight of Canterbury Cathedral, which you see pictured on the right there. That's how it looks today. And this was the seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury since King Ethelred's conversion to Christianity in 597. And it was a site of religious pilgrimage in Chaucer's lifetime. And so more than likely, just on a daily basis, he saw pilgrims coming and going from Canterbury to pay their respects to St. Thomas, Thomas à Becket, who was an archbishop that had been murdered in the cathedral, was actually a Catholic martyr back in the 12th century. During Chaucer's time in Kent, this was a period of intense work for him on his two greatest literary achievements, one of them Troilus and Cressida, and the other one being the Canterbury Tales, which you're reading in this course. So throughout the last decade of his life, he continues in the service of the king, this time employed as clerk of the king's works. So he's responsible for the maintenance of various royal properties up until his death in 1400. And that is his tomb as it looks today in Westminster Abbey, which is where that part of Westminster Abbey is now called Poets' Corner, and a lot of English poets have um, markers placed in that corner. So let's talk now about the Canterbury Pilgrims. And in order to understand um, the, the the poem, you got to understand who these people are, and it's important to understand how medieval society was organized. It was not organized like society today. We think of our society as organized by economic class. So we have the poor, we have the middle class, we have the very, very wealthy. But in medieval times, society was organized more by social roles, and these were identified as the three estates. And the first estate was the nobility. This is the smallest estate. This would be the ruling class at the time. The second estate would be the clergy, so the religious leaders and servants. And then finally, the largest group, the third estate, would be the commoners. This would be everyone else. So this is the estate into which Chaucer was born. His father was simply a wine merchant. He would have been considered a commoner. But this does oversimplify things a little bit because by the 14th century, the commoners were becoming increasingly prosperous. People like Chaucer's father were making a lot of money, and that money bought them power, it bought them influence. And Chaucer was born at this time, so of increasing influence from a more prosperous sort of early middle class. Over the next several hundred years, the three estates would gradually fall apart and be replaced by a class system that's more familiar to us today. But all of the pilgrims, all the Canterbury pilgrims, fit within these three estates. There are no nobles in the pilgrimage. All of the pilgrims come from the estate of the clergy and the estate of the commoners. And they're all identified by their various social positions and occupations. So there are 80 manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales dating to the Middle Ages, but none from Chaucer's lifetime, unfortunately. What you see on the left there is the Ellesmere manuscript. This is one of the most famous and beautiful of the manuscripts, and was created not long after Chaucer's death. I believe that the page we see there is the first page of the first tale, the Knight's Tale, which we're not reading. All these manuscripts, the 80 manuscripts, seem to have been based on a set of fragments, 10 fragments, and each fragment contained a small group of tales. So the first fragment, for example, we'll just call it fragment A, contains the general prologue, the Knight's Tale, the Miller's Tale, the Reeve's Tale, and the Cook's Tale. The last fragment, which we'll call fragment J, contains only one tale, the Parson's Tale, and an epilogue. And all the extant manuscripts that we have place fragment A first and J last, but they disagree on the order of the remaining fragments. So different manuscripts will put the tales in a different order. We don't really know for sure in what order Chaucer intended for the tales to be told. All we can do is make educated guesses based on the prologues to the stories. So there are a total of 30 pilgrims, including Chaucer. Chaucer is one of the pilgrims in the group. And they're all identified in the general prologue to the tales. They leave the Tabard Inn in London, and they are on a religious pilgrimage to the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral. The host of the party, his name is Harry Bailey, and towards the end of the general prologue, he proposes that each pilgrim tells stories to pass the time on their journey. So 2 stories on the way to Canterbury, and then everyone will tell 2 more on the way back. Had Chaucer completed this original plan, he would have composed 120 tales. In the end, he completed only 22. And the Pilgrims, in fact, never make it to Canterbury. Chaucer was unable to finish it out. So the Canterbury Tales then contains an example of a frame narrative. So think of a frame narrative as like an outer story that has stories within it. So on the outside, sort of the outer shell, if you will, there's the story of the Pilgrim's journey, and that's narrated by Chaucer himself. He tells the story in the general prologue, and then we have these prologues to the tales, where the pilgrims talk a little bit about themselves. They comment on some of the other stories that they've listened to, and they interact with each other. And then inside of that sort of outside story, on the inside of it, is are the stories that are told by the individual pilgrims as they proceed, as they move along on their collective journey. So this strategy of organizing narrative is called a frame. So there's the frame narrative, and then there are the individual narratives within it. So this is not a medieval engraving. This was a early 19th century engraving by an artist named William Blake, showing all of the Canterbury pilgrims. Here's the host, Harry Bailey. And up here in the front, there's the knight who tells the first tale. At the end of the general prologue, the knight offers to tell the first tale. There's a sign over the gate identifying the Tabard Inn by Henry Bailey. Zoom in a little bit. Here's Chaucer himself. Here's the miller named Robin. He's described in the general prologue, starting around line 547, I believe. We recognize him there from his bagpipe that he's playing. And then right next to him, conveniently, is Allison, the wife of Bath. And she's described starting at line 447. And she's quite fashionable. She's described as being quite fashionable in the poem. So the artist here got it right. I like her spurs on her shoes down there. So we're reading two stories. The first is The Miller's Tale, and this is an example of a popular medieval genre called a fablio. And these are comic stories. They're funny, in which men and women exchange insults and practical jokes and pranks. They play tricks on each other. There's lots of disguise. The characters in these stories are typically commoners or lower level clergy, and the stories are set in contemporary times, not contemporary to us, but contemporary to medieval times, and everyday locations, places that people would have known, taverns and houses, places on the street, merchant stalls. The humor is sometimes quite obscene. Certainly that's the case in The Miller's Tale. And the outcomes of these stories don't always align with conventional moral expectations of readers. So here are some questions to consider as you read The Miller's Tale. So who are the characters? What roles do they play in society? And which ones do you like the most or least, and why? And what kind of behavior gets rewarded in the story? Who are the winners in the story, and what gets punished? Who are the losers? And in what ways, that's often a useful question to ask when you're analyzing literature, and in what ways does the story challenge or subvert or overturn your moral expectations as a reader? Here is the wife of Bath from the Ellesmere manuscript. She's also wearing spurs. The Wife of Bath's Tale is an example of another popular medieval genre called romance. Unlike fablio, which have realistic characters and settings, Romances are more fantastic and involve knights going out on quests, adventures in exotic realms, and they fight monsters and rescue princesses. A lot of the characters in romances belong to the estate of the nobility. Uh, and romances are not usually bawdy or obscene or morally ambiguous. Typically, they show what it means to live virtuously, rewarding characters. These stories reward characters who uphold the ideals of courtly valor and love. And this is what the loathly lady in The Wife of Bath's Tale calls gentilessa. Here are some questions as you read The Wife of Bath's Tale. What do you make of Alison's character? And I'm speaking here about the prologue, the way she's portrayed in the prologue. In what ways is she appealing to you? In what ways is she maybe off-putting? Maybe it's a mix. Maybe you kind of like her and you kind of don't. Try to pin down your feelings about Allison. And how would you describe her attitude towards marriage? She's had several husbands. So what is her attitude towards marriage? I think we'll get lots of different answers to that question. And then with regard to her story, how does Alison's Tale define and apply the concept of gentilessa? You'll see that word gentilessa mentioned in the tale. And finally, is Alison's Tale consistent with what you know about Alison the person, as you know what she reveals about herself in the prologue to her story? Would you say that the tale is consonant with her character or dissonant with her character? And that concludes this introductory lecture on Geoffrey Chaucer.